Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, The Story Ain't Over. So today I'm doing a very exciting video and that is my top 10 YA books of the decade. So obviously there are a ton of top 10 books of the decade videos going around, and so because I read a lot, obviously, it's hard to narrow down like exactly 10 books of the decade that I absolutely loved. So I decided to give myself a few parameters that would kind of make it easier to decide things. So I decided to go with a top 10 list of the YA books of the decade because, granted, this decade is from 2010 to 2019 up to 2020. And I know some of you will be like, no, technically the decade doesn't end until 2021, but I don't care. So granted, between that time frame, I've grown 10 years. I was 12 when this decade started and I am now 22. So a lot has happened. My whole teen years transpired over these past 10 years. So I thought it would be a good idea to just focus on the YA young adult books of the decade, the ones that I found to be my favorite, the ones that kind of shaped my life or that I thought shaped the YA market. So that's kind of the prerogative that I used to shape this list. But I will say all of these books are kind of ones that I really enjoyed and loved and have a personal meaning to me in some ways. And I am gonna start the list with the ones that I read back when I was 12 years old, back at the beginning of the decade, and then I'm gonna go to the most recent one that I've read. So this doesn't necessarily mean that I liked one over the other, it's just kind of the timeline in which I read them. So I am looking at this as more of a look back on the decade rather than a, oh, you know, which book was better than which. But those are about all of my disclaimers for this video, so let's just jump right in to my first top 10 book of the decade. So the first of the books that I want to share with you today is, of course, one of my all-time favorite series and one that I read when I was, I think, 11 or 12. I think I remember reading them in grade 6 or grade 7, so at the very beginning of this decade, around 2010, 2011, and those books are the Percy Jackson series, the 5 books in the original series, although the later series, the Heroes of Olympus, really kind of shaped my reading as well. These were the ones that really got me into reading. I mean, there were other books that really got me into reading when I was younger, but these ones were ones that I enjoyed so much when I was a kid, and even now as I work at a bookstore, I always recommend these to people who don't like reading a lot, to kids who didn't really enjoy reading because they're just so easy to get into and they're just so much fun. These books I remember made reading so much fun for me, and I just really love that. I will also say that this is not technically a YA series, it is more of a middle grade series, but since Percy is 16 by the end of the series, I feel like it kind of toes the line. But for those of you who don't know, which is gonna be surprising because this has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 years now, but these books follow our main character Percy, who finds out that he's a demigod, so he's a son of a god, and when his mother gets taken by a monster from Greek mythology, he ends up going to this camp called Camp Half-Blood, where he meets these other demigods, and he goes on quests and he tries to save his mother and ends up fighting a bunch of monsters, and it's just a really great time, and it kind of continues in the rest of the books. He goes on different quests and meets other friends, and there's this crazy prophecy that he's trying to beat, and it was just such an amazing series, and it always holds a special place in my heart. Out of the 5, I think my favorite was probably the last one because there's just so much nostalgia value attached to that one, and I was just waiting for so many things to happen, and I thought it was such a great conclusion to the series. So yeah, absolutely love these ones, and I could not include these on this list. All right, the next books that I want to talk about are the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. I read these around the same time that I read Percy Jackson back when I was 11 or 12. These were super huge back then and they're still huge now, and after they got adapted into movies they just got even bigger. But I remember reading the first and second book before Mockingjay had even come out, and I just really enjoyed it. I totally fell into the story, and I thought it was such a smartly written story for such a young audience. It is a very quick and easy read. I think it was the first actual YA book that I had ever read, so I really enjoyed it. Many of you probably already know the story of the Hunger Games. It follows Katniss, who is from District 12 in this near future version of America, which is now Panem, and there are these things called the Hunger Games where 2 kids from each district are put in this battle to the death for the entertainment of the capital, and so Katniss ends up volunteering for her younger sister and goes to the Hunger Games. And you know, has to fight for her life. And I recently reread the first book and it still held up in a lot of ways. Like I still really enjoyed it. I still thought it was a really smart novel. So yeah, I could not go without mentioning these. And I also just remember like getting Mockingjay when it first released, like the day it released, and then quickly going back home to like read it. I like sat in one place and like read it like the whole day and finished it, and I just remember like being destroyed by the end of it, but it was still one of my favorite things. So yeah, could not go without mentioning this in a top 10 books of the decade, because I also feel like it did blow things pretty wide open in the YA market as well. A lot of dystopians came out after this. So yeah, I just really love this. Alright, the next book slash series that I want to talk about, there's actually multiple series that I'm kind of including in one, but they're by the same author and they're from the same world, and those are the Shadowhunters books by Cassandra Clare. So I'm specifically holding up Clockwork Princess, the third book in the Infernal Devices series by Cassandra Clare, because I think out of the ones that came out this decade, I think this is probably my favorite. I know the Dark Artifices series also came out this year, but then of course the Mortal Instruments, the first 3 books came out I think before the decade started. I think they came out before 2010, but I do think I read like City of Glass like after 2010. But regardless, I think out of the ones that came out between 2010 and now, I think the Infernal Devices were my favorite ones, and I absolutely loved this third book. I remember reading this series and just falling in love with it. I loved the characters so much, and I cared a lot about them as well. And I know a lot of people who love Cassandra Clare books as well, and they've continued to be ridiculously popular as well. So I feel like I could not go without including one of her books in this video. But I do remember, you know, picking this up the day it released and being ridiculously excited about it and just wanting to know who Tessa chose and all of that. And I do think out of her books, I think this one had my favorite ending to it, like ever. Like this had just such a crazy, unexpected ending, which I just absolutely loved. So yes, if I had to recommend a Shadowhunters book, I would probably recommend this series and this book specifically. Alright, the next book that I want to talk about is one that not a lot of people talk about, but I remember loving it so much. I read it in high school, probably in like grade 9 or 10, and I remember really loving it. And it is a really old book now. I think I read it like quite a few years after it had already come out. But that book is Graceling by Kristen Cashore. So this is one that not a lot of people talk about. It continues to be one of my favorite books ever, and I think it is one of those cases where YA did a really great job. Like it is one of those really wonderfully written and also really wonderfully imagined books. It is a fantasy book, obviously, and you can probably tell most of the books on this video are gonna be fantasies because fantasy is my favorite. But this follows our main character Katsa, who lives in this world, kind of fantasy world, where people have these things called graces. So they're like these special abilities. So her grace is killing. So she is an assassin for one of the rulers in this world. And so when a prince from like one of the other kingdoms comes to visit her kingdom and he has a grace for combat, they end up interacting and going on like a couple missions together and sort of falling in love. But there's also this like greater mystery, and the world kind of expands in very interesting ways. And I just remember being really blown away by this, and I also just loved the concept of the graces, because people in this world can have graces of just so many different kinds. There's one character in one of the later books who has a grace for like giving people dreams, wonderful dreams, whatever they want. It was just a really interesting world, and I think that's what drew me to it. So this book has like a lot of nostalgia value for me. Like every time I think of it, like I just get a warm fuzzy feeling, and I have reread it since then. It still has stood the test of time, so I think it's an awesome book, and I do think it's a book that, like, regardless of your age, you would definitely enjoy. Alright, the next book slash series I want to talk about is the Legend series by Marie Lu. This is probably unsurprising to many of you, since I, like, you know, did a reread of this and, like, you know, absolutely love it. I didn't include the last book that just came out, Rebel. One, I don't have it with me because I let a friend borrow it, but also I feel like I haven't finished that book, so it's kind of a weird situation. But I think these 3 original books that she originally put out really mean a lot to me. I read them, I think, late in high school. I think the first 2 had already come out when I started reading the series, and it is a dystopian, but I think it took a very different take than many of the other dystopians at the time were doing. And I just absolutely love the characters in this series. It follows 2 main characters, Day and June, and it alternates their perspectives, and it is set in like the far future, and America has kind of divided into the colonies and the Republic. And so it's set in the Republic, where there is kind of one leader, the Elector Primo, and in the Republic there's this thing called the trial, where, you know, based on what you score, that's where you end up in life. So if you score low, then you get like a low paying job, you know, not as good prospects, but if you score higher, you get better job prospects, you know, you get a better life basically. But obviously that skews based on where you came from, where you started before you get to the trial, right? So Day ends up in the situation where he fails the trial and he is sent for dead, and he ends up becoming this hero in this country. The other character, June, is basically a prodigy. She scored perfect on the trial and she comes from a high class family, and when her brother is mysteriously killed and the only like viable suspect is Day, she kind of makes it her personal mission to take him down. And the series kind of spirals from there. But I have such a nostalgia value with this series. I remember just devouring the first book and just really being drawn into it and the world and the ramifications of it, and I think it has some really interesting discussions about a lot of issues. So yeah, absolutely love this. And also the third book was one of those endings that absolutely destroyed me, and I think I am always impressed by series or books that have endings that just make me think about them for years on end. Alright, the next book that I want to talk about is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. I do not think I could have a top 10 books of the decade without mentioning this book, because it has become such a huge thing, such a cultural kind of phenomenon with this book, with the movie, and it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for like years now. This was so huge when it came out, and I read it like quite a few months after it had come out, but I remember reading it and thinking it was a really well done discussion of all of the very real issues going on. It is a Black Lives Matter book. It is a very kind of current event book. This is a book that like doesn't pull any punches. You know, there was also some really wonderful family moments in this book as well, and I remember just falling for Star's family in general. For those of you who don't know, this book follows our main character, Star Carter, who ends up witnessing the murder of one of her childhood friends when he is shot by a police officer for basically being black. And in the aftermath of the event, a lot of people are looking to Star because she was the only witness, and she gets involved in a lot of activism and fighting against police brutality and the kind of systemic racism in America. So it was such a stunning and kind of riveting read, and I absolutely loved it. I do think it's a like YA book that everyone should read. Like, it's definitely one of those ones that like if I was gonna give you a YA book to read, I definitely would recommend this one because it just holds so much value to it. All right, the next book that I want to talk about is one that I like cannot ever imagine not mentioning on a best books of the decade like video, and that book is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This book, this series, this duology, I just absolutely love with like every fiber of my being, and I cannot wait for the adaptation for the Grishaverse. But I remember kind of picking up the Shadow and Bone trilogy way back when in high school, and then picking this series up, this duology. And the reason I'm like choosing this over the Shadow and Bone trilogy is because I do feel like this one was a lot more well loved, and I did personally love Six of Crows better. But I also think it was such a wonderfully done fantasy, just so gripping, but also a really good kind of character study on these 6 different personalities that kind of come together to pull off this heist, this fantasy heist. And I also just absolutely loved the character relationships in this book, and I just remember it kind of taking everyone by storm when it came out. And I also just like personally have a lot of like nostalgic value with this book because I went to the Toronto signing that Leigh Bardugo did for this book, and I remember meeting her and just, you know, feeling all of the feels. And I had just come off of, you know, reading the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and then I found out that there was a character in here who was South Asian, so that was Inej, and I just fell in love. So yeah, she continues to be one of my favorite characters ever, and I just am so excited to see the adaptation, and I know it's just going to be even bigger in the next decade, so I'm just really happy about that. Alright, the next book that I want to talk about is probably a like personal favorite of mine. This author is really huge, which is why I wanted to kind of include one of his books on this list. But that book is Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. So obviously John Green is a huge YA author, and I feel like I could have picked one of his other books. Like, I feel like The Fault in Our Stars was probably his biggest book, even though this one came out afterwards and it was also equally big, but The Fault in Our Stars has the movie adaptation, so it got really, really big. But I personally love this book the most out of all of John Green's books. I have read Looking for Alaska, The Fault in Our Stars, Abundance of Catherines. I've gotten like halfway through Paper Towns, but out of them, I think this one's my favorite. And I think it's because this one felt the most unique out of his previous books, but I also felt like it was the most personal of his books. It was an own voices kind of representation of his OCD, and I remember just reading this and thinking it was just such a well-written book as well. I feel like it has a lot of literary value as well, and I just loved the voice of the character in this book. So it's one of those books that I just kind of really like for its writing, and I know John Green isn't for everyone, but I think this one in particular was just so great. great. It is one of those books that is very much more character focused. Out of all the books that I'm mentioning today, one of the only contemporaries, but I just remember like reading this and just really falling in love with the writing and the story and the main character and just the struggle that she was going through. So yeah, definitely recommend. It is about a girl named Asa. She is 16 years old in high school. She's dealing with her OCD and kind of her family and friend relationships, and then she ends up meeting this boy who is the son of this billionaire who's kind of gone missing, and so there's a reward out to find him, and so Asa along with her friend Daisy are determined to kind of find him, but then Asa's own personal kind of mental health kind of gets in the way. So it really is a lot more about Asa's kind of mental illness and her journey and process with that. I just thought it was really amazing, so definitely recommend it. All right, the next book that I want to talk about is another fantasy, obviously because I love fantasy, but that is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. So obviously, like, I want to talk about this whole series because I absolutely love it, but specifically this book, this is my favorite out of the 3 that are out so far. The 4th one is coming out hopefully soon, but this is a fantasy series with South Asian main characters, which just was all I really needed when I found out about it, with kind of brown kids on the cover, which was just so amazing for me. And I read this last year or the year before, and I remember just absolutely falling in love with it. I think it's just a really well written series as well. It's very fast paced. The fantasy world is just so rich and the magic is just so interesting, and I absolutely love Sabaa Tahir as an author as well, and as a person she's just great. So yeah, out of all of like my favorite kind of fantasy series, this is one of the big ones. I just fell in love with the main characters Laya and Elias, and also Helene, who becomes a POV character in the 2nd book. She's a very complex character as well, and so getting to know each of them and their kind of character growth throughout the series was just so incredible, and I'm just dying in wait for the last book. But basically this takes place in a like high fantasy world where the Martial Empire has kind of taken over the other kingdoms and places in this world, and so Laya is one of these scholars. So her people have kind of been taken over by the Martial Empire, who also has like these generals or assassins called masks, and Elias is kind of training to be one of these masks, but he starts to realize that he might not have the same loyalty to the Martial Empire as everyone else thinks he does, and so he's thinking of running away. But things kind of get complicated when Laya shows up at his school as an undercover kind of spy, trying to find her brother who has been arrested by the Martial Empire, and it's kind of these 2 characters fighting for what they believe in, but also realizing that what they believe in, it might not necessarily be true, and just going through a lot of character growth. Like, I just absolutely love the character growth in this series to pieces. So yeah, one of my absolute favorite series ever. All right, and the 10th and last book that I want to talk about today, the most recent book that I've read that I felt like kind of really encapsulated this decade of YA books that I just really loved, is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is one of my all-time favorite books, and like, I did not expect it to be one of my all-time favorite books. I just kind of went into it without really knowing anything about it and was absolutely blown away. This is one of those books that I absolutely value for the writing. I love the writing style. I love Laini Taylor's kind of vivid imagination, but also the characters in this series. They are all so complex, much like Ember in the Ashes, where all the characters are very complex, have very different sides to them, and may be good people but do bad things. Similarly, many of the characters in this book and in this duology have very complex experiences and make very complex decisions. Basically, it follows our main character, Laszlo Strange, who is an orphan and who has kind of grown up on these stories of this lost city called Weep. And when a delegation from the lost city of Weep kind of arrives in his town looking for different experts to solve a problem in their city, Laszlo kind of jumps at the opportunity, and he ends up traveling to the lost city of Weep and is trying to find out what happened to it, why its name was kind of stolen away, because it wasn't originally called Weep. It had a different name. Because of a magical kind of curse, it was stolen away, and so now all that's left is Weep. And so Laszlo ends up uncovering the problem in the city, and there are lost gods and magical metals and war crimes and enchanted ships and just so many things. I absolutely loved this world in specific. It was one of those fantasy worlds where I had never like read something like it, and it felt so very unique, and I remember just falling in love with it. It is definitely one of those worlds that I could just get lost in for, you know, hours or days or years. I could just read endlessly about this world. So I absolutely loved it, and I just loved Laini Taylor's like magical, beautiful writing as well. But those are all the books that I wanted to talk about today. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you kind of got to see my reading journey, I guess, over the past 10 years. I feel like all the books that I talked about today were big moments in my reading journey, going from like 12 years old to like 22 and just seeing that progression. Obviously all of these were YA, so I was trying to pick ones that like were really big to me, but also I felt like were big to a lot of people in general. So some of my personal favorites like weren't in there just because I felt like they were more personal favorites to me. But I would love to hear from you guys what you thought like the top 10 books of the decade were. Obviously there was other books that were like definitely bigger than some of the ones that I talked about, but I kind of opted for the ones that I liked better. So definitely let me know in the comments what you thought the top 10 YA books of the decade were. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'm just so excited by all that has happened this decade, but I'm also really excited for a new one and for a new year and for all of the reading that I will hopefully do. So thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't yet. I will probably have another video up soon, so I will see you in the next one. But until then, please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!